Tonight's programs accompanies our current thematic exhibition, Gender and Space. And we are delighted to have a group of renowned historians joining us tonight as the moderator and the guest speakers for this conference. Our moderator is Dr. Christopher Meng, who has published extensively on Hong Kong history. He is author of Anglo-China, Chinese People and British Rule in Hong Kong, 1841 to 1880. He's also the co-author with Mace Holsworth of the book Crime, Justice, and Punishment in Colonial Hong Kong, Central Police Station, Central Magistracy, and Victoria Prison. Chris has also co-edited with May Holsworth, the Dictionary of Hong Kong Biography, a collection of more than 500 biographies of lives spanning the whole of Hong Kong history, and it is one of the most well-received publications to researchers working in the field. So Chris will introduce tonight's programs and other guests on stage, and please join me in welcoming all our guests tonight.
Now, the topic this evening, Negotiating Gender Relations, Insights from the Past, is a complicated and difficult issue for reasons that I think will become apparent during the discussion. Now, John has taught history at the University of Hong Kong for many years, and the subjects that he teaches include Hong Kong history, British Empire history, the history of tourism, and the history of museums. He is the chair of the Society of Hong Kong Studies, and he's also director of the MA program in Hong Kong history at Hong Kong U, which was launched earlier this year, in fact, I think a month or two ago. John is the author of A Concise History of Hong Kong and of Edge of Empires, Chinese Elites and British Colonials in Hong Kong, and many other articles and books, including one on the Mui Jai system, the system of female bonded servitude, which he will speak about this evening. His contribution this evening will explore this topic, and he will deal with the disputes over the status of these women in the first 100 years or so of Hong Kong under British rule. He will talk about what this tells us about slavery, labor, and gender, and about being Chinese in the modern world. It's a great pleasure to invite John to speak now on this topic. Thank you, John.
Why the Mui Zai system of female servitude became the center of two controversies, one in the late 1870s and another in the 1920s and the 1930s. Now, these controversies are relatively known in Hong Kong history, but I want to take a slightly different approach, because what I want to try to do today or this evening is to stretch our conception of colonial Hong Kong as a place. Right? I want to stretch it across the British Empire, but also stretch it across the border with mainland China. And what I want to try to do is to show how these controversies were enmeshed in Hong Kong's evolving geopolitical situation. And after all, this Daigun exhibit is not just about gender, it is also about space and place. So the first controversy came from different attitudes toward Hong Kong's geographic, political, and cultural position at the edge of two empires, right? The Chinese Empire and the British Empire. The second controversy was slightly different, because what had previously been mainly a local matter ended up becoming one of the longest and most intense British imperial debates of the interwar period, right? So we're talking about two very different kinds of debates here. At the same time, this debate was also very much a Chinese one. It was not only about slavery, about labor, and about gender, but it was also about being Chinese in a modern world. Now let's start with the first debate. The first Mui Zai debate is October 1879. Chief Justice John Smale, the man here, condemned the Mui Zai practice for violating British and Hong Kong laws forbidding slavery. He later estimated, and nobody knows where he got the numbers, that between 10 to 20,000 girls in Hong Kong were enslaved. And he claimed that Hong Kong was more like the states of the American South back during the slavery days than like, as he put it, the all-pervading civilization of England. Now, Smale's attack alarmed the members of the Chinese elite, led by a man named Feng Mingsan and a few other merchants, they quickly asked the governor, a man named John Hennessy, for permission to form an association to protect kidnapped women and children. They'd in fact asked for something like this several years earlier. But now they reminded Hennessy of the British government's promise, or the colonial government's promise, way back in the 1840s, to let Chinese people practice their traditional customs in Hong Kong. They explained the difference between kidnapping and the Muay Thai system. As they put it, they were as different as pearls and stones. And they also warned that banning the system would force poor families in China to drown unwanted baby girls. Now, Smale had gendered the sale and the purchase of children by focusing on the Muay Thai. The Chinese merchants degendered this issue by placing it into the larger context of selling and buying girls and adopting boys, both of which they claimed were time-honored Chinese customs. As they put it, the selling and buying of girls and slavery were as different as heaven and earth. So the Muay Thai controversy is reminiscent of similar issues in other European colonies. The British government decided that the Hong Kong government should not interfere with local customs, and such old customs. The Colonial Office agreed that ensuring the Muay Thai were not sold into prostitution would be enough. An ordinance was passed for this in 1887, and this was known as the Ordinance for the Better Protection of Women and Children. And then in 1882, the Bo Liang Gok was officially established. Now, Governor Hennessy had hoped that the Bo Liang Gok would end the Muay Thai system, but some critics, in fact, considered it a clever scheme to ensure that wealthy Chinese families had a supply of young servants and to ensure that wealthy Chinese men had a pool of potential concubines. And despite its many commendable activities, and of course there were many, there still are to this day, the Bo Liang Gok may have in fact helped the Muay Thai system last until after World War II. In the 1920s and the 1930s, debates about the Muay Thai were revived, partly because of the increased interest in social welfare in Britain and across the British Empire, and also because British reformers had started to take a stronger interest in Hong Kong, partly because they learned about it. People in the UK learned about the Muay Thai system partly through postcards, which became more widely circulated in the early part of the 20th century. But it also became a debate because of what was going on in China. This was one of the longest and most intense British colonial policy disputes. And in fact, similar debates occurred in the Strait settlements and in other parts of Malaya as well. It had help from all sorts of places. British women in Hong Kong and in Britain. This is what one scholar has called the maternalist moment. The Hong Kong Anti-Muay Thai Society, which we'll see in a few minutes, mainly local Chinese. Members of Parliament back in the UK. Religious leaders in Britain and Hong Kong. International women's and workers' groups. Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill, who had in fact originally defended the system, but then changed his mind and in February of 1922 said that he was not prepared to go on defending this thing, and as he put it, I do not care a rap what the local consequences are. Even the League of Nations got involved. Now, Clara Hazelwood and her husband Hugh Hazelwood, lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy, learned about the Muay Thai system in a church sermon. And they soon started writing letters, many letters, to local newspapers, criticizing the Hong Kong government for tolerating what they called child slavery in a British colony. The Hong Kong government tried to discredit Clara and her husband, as well as Chinese critics of the Muay Thai system. Governor Edward Stubbs, in fact, claimed that Clara was, quote, well known to be a person of unbalanced mind. Stubbs also asked the British Admiralty to transfer Clara's husband back to the UK, which turned out to be a very, very bad idea, because once they got to the UK, they were even freer to publicize or publish their anti-Muay Thai propaganda, and they even published a book, this one here, Child Slavery in Hong Kong. So British activists were the ones who made this an international and an imperial issue, but this debate was also very much a Chinese one. It was not only about slavery, labor, and gender, but it was about being Chinese in a modern world. Because the system had been banned in China after the 1911 revolution, the Republican Revolution, nobody could now claim that it was a legitimate Chinese custom. In August of 1921, the Hong Kong Anti-Muay Thai Society was formed and was an organizing committee that was comprised almost entirely Chinese Christians, many of them from the YMCA and the YWCA, with help from local labor unions. The society soon had about 1,000 members. Local Chinese women played an active role in this anti-Muay Thai movement by offering an alternate view of Chinese custom and culture. And in fact, they were members of a much larger movement for what they called women's emancipation in China. Many of them were Christians. One of them was Fo Hing Tong, who is the third from the left, the co-founder of the YWCA. And these women were part of a nationwide program of Christian-led reform. Two Chinese members of the Hong Kong Legislative Council, Lau Jibak and Ho Fuk, responded by forming the Society for the Protection of Muay Thai. And they were supported by the Donghua Hospital and the Bo Liang Gok committees. This controversy abated temporarily with the passing of the Female Domestic Service Ordinance in 1923, which Lau and Ho reluctantly supported, again as members of the Legislative Council. But the controversy was revived after the Canton government, in March 1927, banned all forms of slavery and canceled deeds for the sale of the transfer of Muay Thai. Reorganized and re-energized, the Anti-Muay Thai Society declared in October of 1938 that conditions in Hong Kong had become even worse. The governor at the time, however, Governor Cecil Clementi, insisted that there was no evidence that the number of Muay Thai had increased, and he also added that the system could not be abolished without alienating the Chinese population, especially as it continued to exist in China, although it was illegal, but the laws were never enforced against it. In 1929, the LegCo passed an amendment requiring the Muay Thai to be registered and paid wages. However, what this meant was that many Chinese people resented being stigmatized for having a Muay Thai. Even though the Muay Thai ordinance was passed in 1930, and in 1938, the colonial government made it compulsory to register all adopted girls, the system ended up lasting much, much longer. And as you might imagine, with the escalating conflict between China and Japan in the late 1930s, it's hardly surprising that the Muay Thai system and this issue, not the system itself, but the controversy began to fade from the limelight. Some cases were reported as late as the 1970s.
Engendering Hong Kong today and engendering everyday life today is to highlight some of the pre-war legacies that lived on after 1945. I'll then explore how a different gender order gradually emerged in Hong Kong, especially after the 1970s. I suggest the issues we have been debating today, including the motherhood penalty and minority rights, have historical roots. Looking into history helps us tackle these issues effectively. That women and men inhabited in Hong Kong after the Second World War. By August 1945, the population was only 600,000. By 1947, the population rose to 1.8 million. So by mid-1950, Hong Kong's population was as high as 2.2 million. So how did this population explosion transform gender and space? The influx of Chinese civilians included many women and men at their peak reproductive years. They quickly settled in Hong Kong, got married, and had children. Pre-war legacies of gender relations lived on. Women continued to play a lesser role in marriages. In the early post-war years, men were allowed to keep more than one wife. It was only in 1971 that the government abolished concubinage, lagging behind mainland China, Singapore, and Taiwan. Compared with senior wives, concubines, or qie, was women's participation in the workforce. Women have always contributed to Hong Kong's industrial development. Many were employed in manufacturing industries as early as the late 1930s. Between 1961 and 81, the number of women workers tripled. These workers included many working-class girls who went straight to factory work right after finishing primary school. Education opportunities were usually given to boys in the family. Many factory girls joined the workforce as early as age 11 to 13. But most of them were not forced to work. They were proud of their contributions to the family. But being able to work allowed these women workers to cultivate their personal space. Single women workers enrolled in evening classes to enrich themselves, and mother workers would enjoy personal space later in their lives when their children became adults. The expansion of higher education and employment also produced many more female leaders, one of whom was Dr. Ellen Lee, wife of Dr. Lei Shupui, who was the first woman to be appointed to LegCo. Ellen Lee played a pivotal role in abolishing concubinage and promoting family planning, which I will talk about in a few minutes. Like pre-war leader Clara Hazelwood, that Professor Carroll has mentioned, by then, women have gradually enlarged the space in education and employment. But in the realm of family, women were still seen as homemakers and reproducers. Even government campaigns of hygiene and cleanliness, Miss Peng An and so on, featured women as the primary homemaker. In the early 1960s, women gave birth to 5 children on average. Most Chinese couples were keen on expanding family size and having male children. It was under this deeply entrenched patriarchal culture that the Family Planning Association of Hong Kong, Ga Gai Hui, strove to redefine what it meant by an ideal family. From 1955, the government started to finance the association's activities. In the early days, the FPHK mainly targeted Chinese civilians from the mainland, specifically working-class Chinese women. The FPHK campaigns provide a glimpse of how gender dynamics were represented in Hong Kong. Before 1970, their activities focused on women rather than men, and birth control was portrayed as a women's responsibility. In 1970, fertility rates remained high. The FPHK drastically changed its strategy and redefined gender roles. It highlighted men's responsibility for birth control. It also strove to lessen couples' obsession with having male children. That year, the Family Planning Association of the UK created its own pregnant men, which is this one on the left-hand side, and the campaign became a big hit in the country, with multiple imitations flooding various regions, including the United States, Korea, and Hong Kong. It's Hong Kong's own pregnant man, featuring a working-class male in a white sweatshirt. Many more campaigns targeting men were rolled out in the coming 2 decades. So from the left, the Greek statue, highlighting men's responsibility, appealing to manliness, right? Yeah, the way you carry the child is to demonstrate your manliness, your ability to protect. Moving on to Superman, definitely responding to the Hollywood craze of Superman in Hong Kong at that time. And in the middle is a tribute to our own Hong Kong footballer, Zhang Zidai, with Zhang Zidai calling men to go for vasectomy, right? Which is this restrained sexual containment as a way of demonstrating manhood. What about for older men in their 40s or later? Yeah, they introduced Guan Deng starring Chinese martial arts hero Wong Fei Hong here. Yeah, also appealing to the favorite television character. And then finally, I have here also the cartoon character Mr. Abel and Duck Go, which is FPHK's own creation, inspired by the rising popularity of Japanese anime in 1980s Hong Kong. So if you have watched that clip of Duck Go, you'll see there's one line saying that, Daddy, I'm smarter than you, right? 阿爸，我醒過嚟 is the idea of appealing to the younger generation. Younger men, you can do even better than the earlier generation. Definitely, it's very hard for us today to gauge these campaigns' effectiveness. But I think they are significant to our discussion today. because they show us how keen the government and the elites were to include men in discussing gender. Including men in family planning was a practical response to women's expanding opportunities in education and employment. By the late 1970s, a different gender order gradually emerged. Fertility rates decreased substantially. Women and men married and had children later in their lives. Many women would have received secondary education. They remained active in the workforce after marriage and childbirth. Many more women opted for a single lifestyle. Marriage and childbearing have become optional. Different from their mother's generation, women of the new generation had largely liberated themselves from the rigid roles of a homemaker and a reproducer. But how did these working mothers delegate family responsibilities? Naturally, husbands took up more tasks, and the chores were also outsourced to grandparents in extended households. But many couples also started outsourcing the work to migrant domestic helpers. What do these migrant domestic helpers tell us about gender and space in Hong Kong? Similar to the Muay Thai, migrants lived-in domestic helpers were half servants, half family members to many Hong Kong families. Since the late 1970s, migrant domestic helpers freed many Hong Kong women from household chores. Ironically, with domestic help, as shown by scholars, Hong Kong women became more willing to give birth to more children. So that's the graph showing you the change. Today, women and men in Hong Kong have largely enjoyed equal opportunities. However, has the burden been only shifted to the other marginalized group of migrant domestic helpers on half the minimum wage? How do we make sense of them who are also other people's daughters, wives, grandmothers, and mothers?
For much of Hong Kong history, the question of women and their role and their status is really men talking about the problem, as they saw it, with other men. And I think this is something we really need to remind ourselves as historians, that so much of the colonial archive, the newspapers, the public debates on these subjects really revolve around men and what men want. The other point I'd like to make, which applies to both of these contributions, is, and I guess it's related to the first point, which is how late Hong Kong was in making reforms. The Muay Thai system persisted, and it was a mixture of forces that caused it to be gradually abolished. But one of these was the situation in mainland China, where, at least on paper, the system was abolished quite early on. And this also applies to a question that Carol touched on, which is concubinage and marital customs, which, again, were part of the law of Hong Kong. In fact, they were incorporated into the law of Hong Kong just at the time when concubinage was beginning to be abolished in China, just roughly at the time of the 1911 revolution. And along with that, there were laws against adultery in Hong Kong, which again persisted until the marriage reform of 1971. And there was resistance against involving women in government, certainly up to 1941. There were proposals to appoint women as JPs, which were rejected by the colonial government. And so all of these things, they just go on and on and on, long after they've outlived their usefulness.